Welcome to an episode of Behind the Scenes, a weekly program unveiling the biggest political developments in the Horn of Africa region. I'm Sudan Mohammed, your host and producer here on HORUFADHI Media. For the past few days, the brotherly nation of Sudan has seen heavy fighting and violence, which has resulted in over 144 civilian deaths and more than 1,409 people being injured, including both civilians and military personnel, according to the Independent Sudani Doctors Union. Now, the latest reports indicate that the Ibn Sina Specialist Hospital, located in the capital Khartoum, has been bombed. Despite no reports of deaths or casualties, the psychological effects are described as detrimental to health workers in a country, according to the SDU, or the Sudanese Doctors Union. The war in the country intensifies. And what could this mean for the Horn of Africa and the surrounding regions, as well as Sudan itself? This is the topic on the program this evening. We hope you find this program very informative. Please like, share, and for similar content, do subscribe to HORUFADHI Media. Also, do subscribe to HORUFADHI Media Group's second channel, known as HORUFADHI TV, where you are currently watching this program, and where you can find other exclusive programs, such as the African Weekly Roundup and Mahaisal, among others. And last but not least, do follow myself, Sultan Mohammed, Suleiman Hashi, Yasin Abdi, and the wider HORUFADHI Media team and our social media platforms that should appear on the screen any moment. Let's get straight into the news. Over 140 civilians and over 1,400 people have been killed and injured in Sudan as the war intensifies between two warring sides: the Rapid Support Force paramilitary group, previously known as Janjaweed, founded by the former Sudan dictator al-Bashir, and the Sudani army, led by al-Burhan, which itself has faced major criticism amongst the Sudanese civil society due to its coup against the civilian government of Sudan, led by Abdullah Hamdok, in 2021. Now, tensions between the Sudani army and the RSF have been growing since the coup in 2021 that removed the civilian government and derailed plans for general elections in 2022, the first in decades. Now, the current political dispute stems from a national agreement signed by the military, the RSF paramilitary group, as well as the leaders of the Forces for the Declaration of Freedom and Change, or the FFC, in December last year. However, some key players refused to participate, of course, with some rebel leaders forming their own political blocs. Additionally, some criticized the fact that there were no deadline set for a transitional period to even begin with. Now, according to the draft, the deal envisions Sudan's military eventually stepping back from politics. The document says it will form part of a new Security and Defense Council under the appointed Prime Minister. However, it does not address creating a transitional judiciary system or say when the transitional government will be put in place. Only then will a two-year transition fully begin, the end goal of which is elections. It also does not address how to reform the armed forces, saying only they should be unified and control should be imposed on military-owned companies. It makes specific mention of Sudan's wealthy paramilitary force, the Rapid Support Forces, headed by Daklo. The force amasses wealth through its gradual acquisition of Sudanese financial institutions and gold reserves in recent years. However, the two biggest disputes arose, and these are the two biggest disputes. Number one, the timetable for the RSF to be integrated into the regular armed forces. The army wanted 2 years, the RSF wants 10 years. The second was when the army would formally be placed under civilian oversight. Now, both sides blamed the other for the outbreak of the violence. The head of the Sovereignty Council, Abdul Fattah al-Burhan, said he was surprised by the Rapid Support Forces attack on his home in Khartoum. And conversely, the head of the RSF, Hamiti, accused the military of launching an attack on paramilitary forces stationed in Khartoum. So, who are the Rapid Support Forces and who is their leader, Mohammed Hamdan Daqlo, known as Hamiti? The Rapid Support Forces have their origins in the old insurgency against the Bashir dictatorship in Western Sudan and Southern Sudan between 2003 and 2005, where dozens were ethnically cleansed in the Darfur region. Now, the Janjaweed, as they would be called, formed from the nomadic Arabic tribes that reside in Western Sudan and the border region with the Chad. The group would turn against the government following the Darfur peace agreement signed in Abuja on the 5th of May 2006, which confirmed their own suspicion that the government would sacrifice their interests to ensure its own political survival. For example, in this agreement, the Janjaweed militia would be disarmed and 5,000 rebels from the Darfur region would be incorporated into the military. And of course, these rebels were the arch enemies of Janjaweed, and the government utilized this dispute between the Arab tribes and the non-Arab tribes in the region by funding the Arab tribes to try and ethnically cleanse the non-Arab tribes. And now for the Arab tribes to see the very government that was supporting them now making an agreement with the arch enemies that they were facing, many of them would now go against the government. And this would result in a group siding with the rebels itself against the government. And in fact, negotiating an alliance with the Darfurian rebels that they had been fighting and threatening to storm the government-held city of Niyala in Darfur. Now, soon Hemeti cut a deal with the government, and Khartoum would settle his troops' unpaid salaries and compensation for the wounded and killed, and he got promoted to general, and a handsome cash payment was received. And after returning to Khartoum's payroll, Hemeti proved his loyalty. This actually proves that this group has always had the interest of itself as an enterprise rather than the national interest of Sudan. And that's the very reason why many people from Sudan are skeptical about what the interest of Hemeti and the RSF actually is, despite the fact that they argue that they are fighting for the interests of the country. Now, al-Bashir officially established the Rapid Support Forces as a separate unit in 2013, initially to fight the rebels of the Sudan's People Liberation Army North in the Nuba Mountains. The new force came off second best, but with a fleet of new pickup trucks with heavy machine guns, it soon became a force to be reckoned with, fighting a key battle against the Darfur rebels in April 2015. Following the March 2015 Saudi Emirati military intervention in Yemen, Sudan cut a deal with Riyadh to deploy Sudanese troops to Yemen. One of the commanders of the operation was General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, who chaired the Transitional Military Council since 2019, but most of the fighters were of Hemeti's RSF, and this brought hard cash directly into Hemeti's pocket. And this, of course, was the beginning of the increase of the wealth of this paramilitary group. In November 2017, Hemeti's RSF forces took control of gold mines in Jebel Amer in Darfur, Sudan's single largest source of export revenues. This followed the defeat and the capture of his arch rival Musa Halil, who rebelled against al-Bashir. Now suddenly, Hemeti had his hands on the country's two most lucrative sources of hard cash. Now, some political analysts have described the actions of the RSF and Hemeti in its current stage as a model of state mercenarism, familiar to those who follow the politics of sub-Saharan Africa, and you probably can see that happening in other parts of Africa, for example, in the Chad region and other regions. Now, on the other hand, with the routine deployment of paramilitary troops to the actual fighting in Sudan's wars at home and abroad, the military has become akin to a vanity project. It is the proud owner of extravagant real estate across Khartoum with impressive tanks, artillery, and aircraft, but it hasn't fought a battle-hardened fight for decades. So its infantry possibly are not as battle-hardened as the RSF. Now, the RSF, formerly known as Janjaweed, have committed mass atrocities against local Darfurian tribes during these wars in the Darfur region. Many probably remember this. It was throughout the 2000s. And dozens were killed, raped, murdered, kidnapped, and villages upon villages were burned down to the ground solely based on ethnicity and color. Now, moving on to the military. So, the military has had its fair share of animosity against the Sudani public. Now, in September 2021, a military coup attempt was thwarted by the government following only 2 years from the coup that overthrew dictator Omar al-Bashir. Now, according to the Ministry of Information, the perpetrators were remnants of the former regime who tried to take control of the state broadcasts, television buildings, the military central command, and following the incident, 40 officers were arrested. And since then, tensions between the military and the civilian leaders rose as military leaders started demanding reforms to the FC coalition, which is the civil society coalition, and called for the replacement of the cabinet. Now, around dawn of October 25th, 2021, Sudan's military arrested at least 5 senior Sudani government figures. Later internet outages across Sudan were reported. Now, according to a Reuters witness, members of the RSF coincidentally were stationed on the streets of Khartoum during this coup. So this demonstrates that Hemeti and al-Burhan were on the same page when it comes to this coup against Hamdan. Now, according to the Sudan Tribune, al-Burhan replaced state governors, under secretaries in the federal ministries, bank and public agency directors by members of the National Congress Party that held power under former President Omar al-Bashir. And that's led to the civilians actually questioning whether the military that seemed to have sided with them in 2019 really was on their side. Now, mass protests were organized by pro-democracy groups in Sudan, and on October 25th, the very day this happened, according to the Ministry of Information, the army used live rounds to disperse the protesters, and the army being the RSF. Now, military forces tried to remove protesters, barricades, and attacked civilians. The Central Committee of Sudanese Doctors reported that soldiers fired on protesters outside the Sudani army headquarters in Khartoum, killing at least 3 people and injuring more than 80 people. 7 people were eventually killed, and over 140 were injured during the first day of protests alone. and military forces, as well as gangs of thugs on plain clothes that were seen all over social media, began beating demonstrators on the streets, with some being heavily injured and others being injured by cars driven into protesters and demonstrators. Now, protesters throughout Sudan carried banners in support of Hamdok and criticized Egyptian President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi. And protests also held signs stating the Emiratis will not govern us, nor the implementation of Sisi. And this demonstrates the level of foreign interference in Sudan, which is so high that the public of Sudan are highly aware that the Emiratis and the Egyptians and these other Arab countries are competing with competing interests for what happens in the country. But why the coup? Why now? That's the question many were asking. Now, factors motivating the military to hold the transition to democracy included, firstly, the personal risk of national and international war crime charges and their risk of losing control of the gold trade. So we know the RSF, as I've stated, have control over Sudan's largest gold mines. The military has tons and tons of companies, private companies that they own, among other things, land, property, uncountable. They have millions upon millions in wealth. And on top of this, these groups and leaders of these groups have committed crimes against the Sudani people. And everyone in Sudan knows this. And for this reason, many of these groups do not want, for example, the military, the RSF, them giving over power to civilian rule will lead to accountability. And this is one of the many things that they are concerned about. And this comes from the Rule 10, subsection C of the 39th month transition to democracy, agreed between the military and civilians in 2019 when the coup happened. And it said that the chair of the Sovereignty Council of Sudan should be transferred to civilians selected by the FFC, civilian members of the Sovereignty Council, in November 2021, leading to certain risks for Al-Burhan and Hameti. So the main question is there a possibility of peace? And what effect could this have in the wider Northeast Africa region? Now, the Sudani army on Tuesday rejected calls for a ceasefire in the country and accused the RSF of seeking to mobilize more troops. Now, the RSF leader earlier on Tuesday posted a tweet announcing his approval for a 24-hour cessation of hostilities to establish a humanitarian corridor to evacuate wounded civilians. However, the army spokesman claimed that they had received information about RSF's preparation to launch a new attack in Khartoum. In fact, the army spokesman said that the RSF were preparing to receive military aid plane from regional allies and that the troops would move from Darfur to Khartoum, indicating the involvement of foreign players. And many have accused the UAE of playing a substantial role in this. And the Sudani Army Commander-in-Chief Abdel Fattah al-Burhan did not make a public reaction to the proposal, but he made a statement to CNN on Tuesday where he accused the RSF of violating a proposed ceasefire on 2 consecutive days, on Sunday and Monday. On those days, there were peace ceasefires proposed, one for an hour, one for more than that, possibly 3 hours. And these were created to allow humanitarian corridors for people to be able to leave and get emergency supplies. And these were, of course, broken because videos emerged online showcasing gunshots and mortar fire, despite the fact that there was a peace or a ceasefire agreed between the two sides. Now, Al-Burhan confirmed that a humanitarian ceasefire proposal had been suggested and accepted, but he condemned that the RSF had exploited the humanitarian pause to carry out mortar attacks on army headquarters. Now, RSF, from their angle, have also accused the military of doing the same thing. Now, ultimately, the two most powerful men in Sudan are facing off for control, with both concerned about the transition to civilian rule, curtailing their power and wealth, as well as the possibility of prosecution of possible war crimes within both ranks. Additionally, both want to exert the ultimate say in Sudan, as both are being pushed by foreign nations that have competing vested interests in Sudan's instability and lack of democratic rule. This was evident in a 2021 coup, which many have said received support from neighboring nations that were against the idea of a Sudani general election in which the people of Sudan decide their future. Ultimately, the conflict in Sudan is detrimental to the Horn of Africa region as a whole. Firstly, it borders Ethiopia to the south, which has seen its own fair share of instability in recent years, with the Tigray war causing refugees to flee to Sudan. There already exist tensions now between the Tigray and the Sudani tribes for grazing land on the border regions. There are also issues concerning the instability rising in the northern Ethiopian state of Amhara, where resistance to the disbandment of state forces there has caused unrest, among other things. An unstable Sudan provides a safe haven for possible rebels from the Amhara region or any other region along the border with Ethiopia, and this could prolong wars if there were another internal conflict in Ethiopia. Similarly, it provides an avenue to smuggle weapons, among other things, for rebel groups. Now, Somalia is also a country which is probably the most unstable country in the Horn of Africa. And it's not far from Sudan. So the possibility that Sudan could collapse creates the perfect environment for militancy and extremism to flourish, as we've seen in neighboring Yemen, which has been a major problem for Somalia's security, as Yemen harbors Al-Qaeda among other groups, which are Al-Shabaab affiliates. And therefore, an unstable Sudan will only make Somalia further and furthermore unstable, because what it means is the possibility of an unstable Ethiopia, and that is not good news for Somalia. The possibility of new safe havens of militant groups, because we already have militant groups based in Yemen, which are just across the pond, but we also have militant groups based in Uganda with the ADF and other groups like this who are not Al-Qaeda but they're Daesh. Now, the possibility of similar groups forming in Sudan, which is just northwest of Somalia, across Ethiopia, is also concerning, because then there's too many avenues of militant groups surrounding Somalia, which allows the militants in Somalia to continue to receive weapons, support, and manpower. Now, ultimately, the possibility of further instability in the Horn is much higher, and there must be an immediate intervention by neighboring countries and organizations such as IGAD, IGAD, and the Arab League to halt this violence immediately and return to dialogue to ensure that Sudan remains stable, not just for the region, but also for its own people that have suffered enough under dictatorial rule for nearly 30 years and now military rule.